Hello and welcome to this Q&A episode of Talking Politics US. Thanks for all your questions. Please do keep them coming to talkingpolitics@itv.com. I've got an all-star cast this week. Correspondent Robert Moore, former White House advisor Laura Schwartz, and our US correspondent Dan Rivers. Thank you very much all indeed for being back to us. So let's jump straight to our first question, which is actually a two-parter from Anthony Martin on Facebook. The first part is asking, in what era was America greatest? And then part two, what will have changed when America is great again? That is such a good question. Laura, I'm going to put that first to you, then to Dan, then to Robert. I think we should all have I want to give you all a word on this because it's quite a tricky one to answer. Laura, you first.
I think it'd be sacrilege if I didn't say the early 1990s because, of course, I worked in the Clinton administration. It was the largest surplus ever at $237 billion President Clinton and the administration left America with. Took largest ever pay down in American debt 3 years in a row. We had an assault weapons ban and shootings were down. There were definitely things that needed to be improved upon, like don't ask, don't tell in the military when it came to gays serving. There were many things that were controversial. But right now, as we're focused on the economy here in America, and we should be, that's what comes to my mind and why.
I think I would maybe plump for FDR's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 4 terms, and maybe the fact that he led America out of the Great Depression through the Second World War, the New Deal to sort of reinvigorate the US economy. So much achieved. I think he did 99 executive orders in his first 100 days, so not quite as many as Donald Trump, but certainly he went off at quite a kind of fast clip, trying to turn around the country after the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression.
Robert, before you answer, can I just twist the question slightly? I'm interested to know which you think was which period you would pick that maybe symbolizes America's greatness of the past. But let me ask you the question a slightly different way. Do you think America will be great again in the way that we have known it through the last 100 years of history?
Well, I mean, look, you're talking about preeminence, and there was a sort of set of circumstances in the sort of 1990s after the collapse of the USSR that made America preeminent as a sort of diplomatic power, but also as an economic power. And as Laura points out, with Bill Clinton, we had an extraordinarily gifted communicator. I just think the sort of tectonic plates of the world have changed. No one can deny the rise of China. We have to recognize that India is also kind of a sleeping giant now that is waking up. So I don't think there's ever going to be the sort of preeminence that America enjoyed in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. But in terms of that excellent question from our listener, I mean, I think I would sort of tend to agree with Laura's just because of those exact sort of geopolitical movements in the world and how sort of Clinton became that great communicator, able to sort of reinvent the idea of a center ground in American politics, one that is completely collapsed, imploded at the moment. Nobody is occupying that space currently. That I would give a sort of tip of the hat to Bill Clinton and his attempt to try and reinvent that space in American politics.
Okay, next question comes from June on email, who wants to know, how is Trump allowed to issue so many executive orders? Why don't they have to be ratified by the US government as our laws by Parliament have to be? It seems like policy is being decided on the whim of one man. Laura, you've worked in the White House. What would you say to that?
Well, executive orders are just that. They're orders, but they're very important for shaping policy. But they're most often used as tools because it's Congress that has to create the law, and it's the federal agencies that have to enact the orders. And the Supreme Court has ruled back in about 1952 that executive orders must be rooted in either the Constitution or an act of Congress. And if the president oversteps, Congress has to clamp down. Now, I was speaking on the podcast last week about the fact that the Republicans aren't really keeping Trump in check, and they hold both houses of Congress. So where does that check come? In June, I think that check on executive orders comes in the courts, and that's what we're going to see this summer. We're going to see a lot of those executive orders that are in legal fights now kind of come to fruition, and many of them are going to see the Supreme Court. But yeah, executive orders are most often used as a tool to try to shape policy, and he certainly is so far.
Robert, you talked on the podcast earlier this week, and I wanted to ask both you and Dan about it now, about, Congress and, the midterms and what may or may not change. I mean, ordinary members of the Republican Party, ordinary members of the House of Representatives have been very, very quiet in terms of opposing Trump. Does that change in the run-up to the midterms, in your view, both of you, if Trump's approval ratings continue to bump along the bottom or perhaps even descend further?
No, I don't think it does change. I mean, look, 89% of Republicans believe that Trump is simply fulfilling his campaign promise. This is Trump's Republican Party. The key to understanding why, he has this extraordinary loyalty amongst congressional Republicans is to understand, look, they have to win primaries before they face a Democratic opponent. And to win a primary, you have to have the sort of Trump base that is absolutely going to turn out and vote. So I think loyalty in both the House and the Senate to Donald Trump, they're going to give him enormous deference right through the 2026 midterm election. So I don't see any break, any rupture in that. But, yes, I mean, lots of congressional Republicans will be looking at those opinion polls and wondering in which direction they're going to go over the next year or so.
Dan, I want to amend the question slightly. Sorry for you. Do you think that Trump's approval rating can sink much further, or do you think the MAGA base will just always be loyal to him no matter what, and therefore there's a floor below which he won't ever go?
Yeah, I think there's a flaw, isn't there? Because as Robert alluded to, there is a loyal base who will always back Donald Trump no matter what he does. I don't know where that floor is, though. Have we got another 5 percentage points, maybe another 10? I don't know. There obviously is an opening for the Democrats next year with the midterms to try and find their voice, really. I mean, they have been sort of politically neutered a bit by Donald Trump and unable really to push forward any kind of leadership or unified voice, really. And maybe this is the opportunity going into the midterms next year when if there is increasing dissatisfaction with Donald Trump, that they can try and find that voice and try and claw back some of the seats in Congress and find a way forward to 2028.
Tom, I'm aware that you haven't yet nailed your flag to the mast in terms of the best era for American politics or your favorite American president.
Oh, that's so difficult, isn't it? I mean, that's like all the things you spent time cogitating about when you were a student, really. I mean, Dan's probably, FDR. I think you're right. That period of American preeminence that came out of the Cold War and the sort of Clinton era, even the Obama era, which in its own way continued from it. I mean, I guess what I would say is that, I grew up to... The thing I spent most of my university time studying was the Vietnam War. And that was a sort of interesting prism, if you like, through which to view post-war American foreign policy, because almost everyone, I think, would now accept it was the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. And, the Americans did plenty of things that many of them lived to regret during the conduct of it. But as you've made the point, Robert, you and I came into journalism, came out of being students at an extraordinary, turning point in world history. Everything that we'd grown up to think was static, the Cold War, came to a close. And it led to tremendous optimism almost every way you looked. Again, as we talked about before, the early part of my career was in Ireland. I was Ireland correspondent for ITV News, at the age of whatever I was, 25. I turned up there to a conflict, the Troubles that had been going on for decades and looked like it would go on forever. And suddenly we were confronted by the possibility that it was ending, and then the reality that it was ending. And, I will never, ever, ever forget watching Bill Clinton's limousine go down the Falls Road, where I had spent so many hours standing, reporting on these desperately depressing murders and atrocities, and yet here was an American president who felt like he descended from outer space to help facilitate this incredible moment. So you're right, that was the era of American preeminence, and it felt like under American leadership, however flawed the Americans might be, that the world was going in the right direction. And now sometimes it feels the world is not going in the right direction, and we can argue who is or isn't to blame for that. But that's, I think, the change that's happened in my lifetime, from feeling like, however flawed it might be, America was leading the world in a good direction. And now I feel like, to some extent, what we're witnessing is a sort of abdication of American leadership, quite consciously. And I don't know where that's going to leave us. And I guess that's what I find a bit frightening. Kay Chalice on Facebook, who asks, is it safe for LGBTQ foreigners to visit the United States? Laura, you're the only American on this podcast. You've been in the White House, you've seen policy. People are clearly afraid. I think we should acknowledge that. You mentioned that, visitors from Canada have massively dropped. Tourism numbers are dropping. Are people right to be frightened, do you think, or not?
Well, Tom, if I may say, all my life I consider myself a great ally of the LGBTQIA community. And then about 8 years ago, out of the blue, I met my now incredible wife, Susan, and we're celebrating 6 years of marriage this May. And I do look at LGBTQ issues differently now, through a different lens. And I do believe America is absolutely safe for LGBTQ visitors. Absolutely. But I will say this. Different states, Kay, have different rules and regulations, different laws that they've passed. And some states are just plainly more welcoming to the LGBTQ community. And the Human Rights Campaign does a wonderful study on this every year. And there are a few other resources out there as well. When you look at Illinois, where I live, a very blue state, a very open state, gay rights state, versus Texas, where it's overwhelmingly the opposite, except in some cities like Austin. And Florida also has had some really terrible legislation in regards to the LGBTQ rights. So please come. Enjoy our country. I certainly do. But you might want to just look at some of the areas that you want to visit so that you also feel real comfortable as well.
Dan, I'm going to put this question to you. Rob wants to know, is there anything that is actually politically damaging to Trump?
Good question. It feels like all of the normal parameters that are around a president that don't apply to Donald Trump. And he is willing to say things that other presidents simply aren't willing to say. You'll remember what he said about Gaza, sort of turning Gaza into a sort of, resort, full of casinos and hotels and so on. Things that people wouldn't even joke about in private. So it feels like there is very little that he is not willing to say in public, talking about turning this country where I am right now, Canada, into the 51st state, or about, taking Greenland from Denmark, or the Panama Canal over. So to me, it feels like he is completely unbound and unfettered when it comes to what he is willing to say and what he is willing to contemplate. How much he's actually able to enact some of these more crazy ideas, I think it is a different question. And there are clearly, we've seen with tariffs, boundaries, the bond market very clearly, came to bear on that, and he was forced to do a U-turn, even though he didn't want to. So there are some things which, simply, political gravity will drag him back to the centre ground.
Robert, this one to you. Mark asks, if you could meet one US president, who would it be and why? I think you should begin, Robert. You've presumably met quite a few presidents. Who have you met, and who would you like to meet I'm guessing possibly someone who isn't alive anymore. But is there a president that would stick out that you'd particularly like to meet?
Oh, I think, wouldn't we all want to sort of sit and have tea with Abe Lincoln, right? I mean, that would be the, particularly in the trauma, the crucible of the Civil War. What was he thinking? How was he keeping his morale up as Americans were slaughtering their fellow Americans? So I think, Lincoln is the answer, I think, for most observers of American politics. More books have been written about Abraham Lincoln, I think, than all the other presidents put together. He's kind of the inspirational leader who sort of echoes through the last 150 years more than any other. You only have to walk down the National Mall here and walk up those iconic steps to the Lincoln Memorial to sort of see how Americans still look at the Gettysburg Address in awe that's engraved on the side of the monument. I've met a few American presidents. I've thrown a few questions at them. Can't say that I know any of them well enough, but sort of Lincoln for sure is the one I'd like to have a chance to interview if time travel was a thing.
Laura and Dan, Laura, you first. Any advance on that, or would it be Lincoln for both of you too?
It was absolutely Lincoln for me. And I will say this, Doris Kearns Goodwin and John Meacham, both great American historians, have incredible books on Lincoln. But what really struck me is that he always opened his cabinet meetings with a joke. And one of his cabinet secretaries asked him one day that he said, we are in this great inflection point in our country, the Civil War. We have death and dying all around us. How can you joke in a time like this? And he looked over at the cabinet secretary and said, if I would not laugh, I would cry. And he always kept this semblance of humanity, I think, in every single one of his decisions. And that's something I'll always carry with me from studying him.
Dan, any advance?
I think I'd probably pick one who witnessed the funeral of Lincoln, the other Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, just because he was such a larger-than-life character. He was president at the beginning of the 20th century, but did so much. He was in the Spanish Civil War leading the Rough Riders. After he was president, he went off up the Amazon and almost died of a tropical disease. He went to Africa on safari. He survived assassination. I mean, he was a real larger-than-life character who sort of epitomized, living the kind of American dream in Dakota and so on. So, in terms of someone that I'd just like to go and go horse riding with or something, and have a beer with, I think I'd choose him.
Well, Dan, we've established on News at 10 over the past year that you can, in fact, ride a horse. I mean, who the heck knew that? Interesting trivia.
It was a very docile horse.
My favourite cabinet quote of all time is from the UK cabinet. You probably all heard it. The Duke of Wellington, of course, our famous war leader at Waterloo, who later became Prime Minister, and was asked by his wife after the first meeting of his cabinet what it had been like. And he said, well, I'm damned if I didn't give them my orders, and then they sat around wanting to argue about them all day, which he couldn't get his head round at all. And that gives me the chance to move on to our final question, a little update on a question, in fact, we had a couple of weeks ago about whether the rumors were true about the state of Barack and Michelle Obama's marriage. Laura, you answered very definitively that they were not getting divorced, and now Michelle has had her own say on her own podcast. Let's have a listen.
My decision to skip the inauguration, what people don't realize, or my decision to make choices at the beginning of this year that suited me were met with such ridicule and criticism. Like, people couldn't believe that I was saying no for any other reason, that they had to assume that my marriage was falling apart.
Right.
Now, can I ask you all for a final word on this? I mean, I don't think any of us thought the Obamas were getting divorced, but I thought what she had to say on this podcast, Laura, maybe you pick up first since you answered the question, but I thought it was pretty interesting and a kind of turning point, maybe in a way, in the sense of someone speaking up and saying, well, I didn't do it because I just didn't want to do it and I didn't feel I should have to do it.
Yeah, I think Michelle Obama actually has really started a conversation in America and the world about the power of saying no, about doing what's right for you and yourself at that moment. She reflects on the 8 years with Obama, incredibly difficult, and she's just grateful that her children made it out okay. But now it's time also to focus on herself and find herself and make decisions according to what matters to her. And I think that this power of no is something we're going to start talking about. And I think it's great that it's in the ether of all cultures. And it'll be interesting to see how she picks up on this in her podcast and other programs that she's doing.
Robert and Dan, final word. Robert, you first. Final words to you.
Well, I think anybody who's got daughters would appreciate what Michelle Obama was essentially saying, which is, look, you can control your own destiny. You haven't got to just follow the sort of patriarchy. You don't have to adhere to sort of the protocols of turning up to something if you don't want to. That you know, in the cases of my young daughters, you know, they can decide what they do and what's appropriate for them. They can make that judgment, and nobody should be able to second guess that.
I would say certainly my two daughters definitely tell me what they do and don't want to do on a daily basis. So all power to her. And also the power of no, as expressed by Melania. I mean, you know, she's someone who's regularly decided not to turn up to things and not do things that she doesn't want to do. So we can reflect on her setting that example too, maybe.
That's all we have time for. Thank you all so much once again. Please do keep your questions coming, talkingpolitics@itv.com. Please do subscribe so that you don't miss out on an episode, or watch us on YouTube or ITVX. But for now, thank you very much indeed for giving us kindly your time. Goodbye.